Hello, this is the sermon for the third Sunday after Pentecost, Sunday, June 14th, 2026. And the texts preached on are Genesis chapter 18, verses 1 to 15, and chapter 21, verses 1 to 7, Romans chapter 5, verses 1 to 8, and Matthew chapter 9, verse 35 through chapter 10, verse 23. Last week, we were introduced to Abraham and Sarah, or Abram and Sarai as they were then called. At that time, God spoke to Abraham, promising to make of him a great nation, but without saying how this would be accomplished. God's daring here is remarkable, since it had already been established that Sarah was barren. She had no child. You may remember that on Trinity Sunday, we heard the first creation story from Genesis. In that story, God creates the heavens and the earth in 6 days, culminating in the creation of humankind in God's image. The early chapters of Genesis tell how humankind progressively loses its capacity to bear God's image through sin. God chooses Abraham and Sarah as the people through whom God would begin the process of restoring humanity's capacity to bear God's image, which is what God means when God tells Abraham that in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Today we hear God tell Abraham and Sarah how God will fulfill God's promise to Abraham to make of him a great nation. God appears to Abraham in the guise of 3 men, and after Abraham offers them hospitality, one of them says to him, "I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife Sarah shall have a son." And this is actually the second time that God tells Abraham that Sarah will have a son. The first time is in the preceding chapter of Genesis, which also happens to be when God makes the covenant of circumcision with Abraham. At that time, Abraham laughs at God's promise. In today's story from Genesis, it will be Sarah's turn to laugh. And we do hear today how God fulfills God's promise to Abraham and Sarah that they will have a son. Yet God's promise to them that they will have a son is still breathtaking when you consider their age. As the story tells us, Sarah, by all rights, was long past the age where she could become pregnant. It had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. When one of the strangers says to Abraham and Sarah, "Is anything too wonderful for the Lord?" the natural reaction would be to reply, "Yes." In choosing Abraham and Sarah, God chose the unlikeliest people through whom to begin the process of reconciling humankind with God's self. This is the beginning of a pattern in the Scriptures. God frequently chooses the unlikeliest people to do God's will, or to bear a message from God. This pattern continues in our story from Matthew's Gospel, in which Jesus chooses out of his followers 12 men to be commissioned as apostles. Now, this is the only place in Matthew's Gospel where the word apostle is used. One downside to this story from our perspective is that here Jesus does not name any women as apostles, although we know from the letters of the Apostle Paul that women would indeed be leaders in the early church. In Matthew's Gospel, we find the stories of the calling of Peter and Andrew, of James and John, and of Matthew. Jesus finds each of them and calls them from their occupation, and they drop everything and follow him. Jesus must have made quite the impression on them for them to do something so extraordinary. Peter, Andrew, James, John, and Matthew belong among the unlikeliest people for Jesus to call, because their occupations provided them with no experience or legitimacy to be apostles, sent to proclaim the coming of the kingdom of heaven. In institutional churches such as the Anglican Church, the sense of being called by God for mission is often limited to bearers of a religious vocation, such as clergy. But the stories of Abraham and Sarah and of the 12 apostles should remind us that God calls unlikely people to do God's will. It is unfortunate that our church has historically downplayed the idea of a vocation or calling from God among lay people, because it denies to people the power that comes from a sense of having been called by God to do God's will. Such empowerment properly belongs to all the baptized. The mission of Jesus and of the 12 apostles is the continuation of the long arc of the redemption of fallen humanity, an arc which began with the calling of Abraham and Sarah to be a blessing to all the families of the earth. We Christians profess by faith that the death and resurrection of Jesus is the completion of that arc, the fulfillment of salvation history. We now live in an era of grace, a grace which is obtained, as the Apostle Paul says in his letter to the Romans, through our Lord Jesus Christ. Through the death and resurrection of Jesus, we have peace with God. God is reconciled with us. God has restored humankind's capacity to bear God's image, which is what humans were created to do. And this is grace because it is all God's initiative. Fallen humanity was powerless to make things right with God. As Paul says, God proves his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Although since the death and resurrection of Jesus, the world has been once for all reconciled with God, it is a reconciliation that is not yet perfect. There are still those who oppose God's reconciling love by perpetrating injustice. Even here in Canada, where political leaders usually act for the common good, there exist unjust structures and systems that continue to oppress or impoverish people. God's will is not yet done on earth as it is in heaven. This means that the mission to which Jesus has called the 12 apostles continues to be the mission to which the risen and ascended Lord calls the church. As Jesus instructed the 12, the church is likewise instructed to proclaim the good news that the kingdom of heaven has come near, to cure the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, cast out demons. In other words, the church is called to do God's will through acts of healing and liberation. Now, we might feel discouraged rather than encouraged to hear that Jesus calls the church today to the same mission to which he called the apostles. Very few, if any, of us are likely to feel that we have been empowered to cure the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, and cast out demons. We do not have to be discouraged, because those are not exclusively the tasks to which we have been called. We may understand the mission of the Church as a calling to meet the needs of people for healing and liberation. And such healing and liberation can take many forms. The important thing is to respond to those who are harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd, with the same kind of compassion that Jesus did. The other important thing is to recognize that, by virtue of our baptism, each of us has been both called and empowered to carry out the Church's mission of bringing healing and liberation to the world God created and loves. We may not have experienced an explicit sense of calling to mission, yet God has indeed called us. God calls the unlikeliest people to do God's will, so there is no reason why God cannot call us to mission as well. If we are not sure where to begin, it may help to remember that our mission is to respond with compassion to the needs of those around us. Such a response does not have to be complicated or beyond our ability. Any of us could at least be a caring shoulder or a listening ear, for example. Indeed, we are already reaching out to our communities with love, such as through our support of the North Dundas Christmas Fund. The point is that we do not have to limit ourselves to such ministries. We have what it takes to do more to bring God's healing and liberation to our neighbors whom we are called to love. All it takes is a little creativity to imagine ways to help, and the daring to try it.